Welcome to Learning with Lee, a show where we talk about nature and wildlife on Kiowa Island. I'm Lee Bundrick, Land Preservation Coordinator for the Kiowa Conservancy and your host. Today we decided to go out in the field, showcase one of our properties that we have on Kiowa Island. So today we picked Rabbit North, which is fairly visible to pretty much anybody. If you're coming to Kiowa Island, it's right on the left, right before you get to the main part, where the gate is. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the habitat here and some of the features that you would see. The best way to describe this place, it's Hummock Island. So before the parkway was built, this was pretty much surrounded all by marsh. And it has its own little tiny ecosystem. And what this place is actually a what used to be a dune ridge where the shoreline of the Atlantic Ocean used to be. If you see behind me is the marsh, and right behind it is Kiowa Island. Where that marsh is now is actually what used to be where the Atlantic Ocean was about 4,500 years ago, and is now a thriving wetland community. Keep talking about the habitat here. What you would see is about 3 different types of habitat. I'll talk a little bit about each one of them. So right on the edge you would have what we call high marsh habitat. You would see things like sea oxeye daisy, black needle rush, salicornia. This is sea oxeye daisy. It grows along the marsh edges, and it produces a little yellow flower that attracts bees and butterflies fairly often. And this is pretty much evergreen all year round. And whenever the flowers kind of die off, you'll actually see them produce these little spiky balls that on top. And those are actually the seeds from the plant. If you're looking at the marsh and you see a lot of really dark vegetation, it kind of looks a little sticky, that would be black needle rush. And walking through it, you would actually get to see why they call it needle rush, because it actually pokes you and often goes through your clothing. That's basically the high marsh habitat you would see here. And beyond that is all Spartina grass, and it kind of is different heights based on the tides that influence it. Right on the edge of the high marsh, kind of towards inland areas, is the salt shrub thicket. And there's a lot of really interesting plants here. You start to see a lot more woody growth. So you can see behind me, you have a few of these trees as well. So you have kind of the eastern red cedars, the common cabbage palmetto. You'll have some oaks growing in here. A lot of live oaks like to live in these areas, but all of the trees that typically are in these areas are very short. They don't get too tall. Most of the pine trees you'd see here only get about 15, 20 foot tall at most. This one behind me is pretty large, probably a little bit further upland than some of these other ones, but it's typically what you would see. And then you also have this shrubby vegetation underneath. So you have the tall canopy of the trees, relatively tall. Then right below it, just below it, is this shrubby vegetation. And behind me, you'll actually see a lot of wax myrtle. This is pretty common in these areas. I also have a lot of grasses and such. Basically just really low growing vegetation that forms a thicket, and this provides a lot of cover for wildlife. Sometimes you'll also see even some interesting plants. You see right here, we actually have prickly pear cactus that grows naturally in these areas. And you can see right now it's actually flowering. It has little flowers that are growing on top of it. But yeah, and you also see on the ground right here, you have this thing called Yaupon holly. Pretty common on Kiowa Island, pretty much everywhere in the coastal region. A very good plant and fuels a lot of the wildlife on the island. So you see these areas, so you have low growing marsh, kind of medium growing salt shrub thicket, different habitats, and then you have more or less what we call a maritime forest, at least a small thin band of it on this little area. So right on top of this dune ridge right here is really tall trees, and a lot of these are pine trees mostly, but you can see that there's a few oak trees in this area, and also some low-growing understory trees. Some of the understory trees include the cabbage palmetto, some other hollies. There's There's Ilex opaca, the normal American holly, and then Ilex vomitoria, which is the Yaupon holly, which grows all sorts of heights. It will grow either up to your ankle or 16 foot tall. There's a lot of variation in between. This is a sparkleberry plant, Vaccinium arboreum. The way you can tell is it has these glossy round leaves that kind of form an umbrella effect, sort of. And then you see that the bark on it, it has kind of striated. It's a little bit kind of like brownish gray. Very interesting plant, but it produces little white flowers right here that kind of look like blueberries. But this feeds a lot of wildlife, and it doesn't occur as much as the Yaupon holly, but it's still got its numbers. And I've found them mostly kind of in this area towards Oyster Lake and the Riverview neighborhood. Here's another one right here. How about that? So you can see behind me more maritime forest habitat. You also see that, hopefully the camera lens isn't distorting this or anything, but I'm kind of on top of a mound right now. So you have kind of a slope that goes up, tops out, and then goes down. So there's marsh on both sides. Pretty frequently. This is the American holly. This one is about 10 foot, 12 foot tall. You'll see these on some of the more upland areas in Kiawah Island. This right here is a plant you'd see very, very often. This is red bay. It has a very nice scent to its leaves. It's related to the tree that produces bay leaves. The red bay here actually have a disease, a fungal disease that attacks the leaves and actually makes them curl up. And some of them actually have this black sooty thing that happens to them, which has caused their populations to kind of fall and since habitating the island. But you can see that just some of them just have these black leaves, and these usually tend to be the ones that are affected. But they're still growing pretty well. Some of them are very healthy. This one's pretty healthy, I think. It's getting eaten up a little bit by insects, but it's about that time of year. Take a look behind me. This area right over there kind of extends close to the parkway as well. It's called Mingo North and Mingo South. That's our conservation easement area. That's also a preserved area. I think it's about 13 acres and has similar habitats. Mostly it has the salt shrub thicket and marsh habitats, but it has a little bit more variation of marshes. There's a lot more high marsh variations in habitat. This is probably an area on the island I've seen the most amount of coral bean. This is the coral bean I was talking about. It produces these nice little red flowers right here about this time of year, and it's very showy. They have little tiny thorns on them on the edge, and they kind of grow out like that from a center point. They're very pretty, very showy. Once these actually fruit, they have these brown capsules that they grow out, and it doesn't look showy until it pops open, and like the name suggests, produces a coral type bean that's about this color. Very interesting plant. Join us again next time for another episode of Learning with Lee.